With our top focus being Belarus, as faced with mounting protests and under immense pressure from his own people, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has now changed his tone. Lukashenko has now said that he will be willing to share power and to make changes to the constitution. He also said that work is already underway on possible changes which can be made to the constitution, but the long-ruling strongman has also made it clear that he is not prepared to make any far-reaching changes to the constitution while being under pressure from the protesters. This change of tone from the president comes at a time when opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya came out with a video message saying that she is ready to lead Belarus. The opposition challenger had earlier fled to Lithuania amid crackdown on election protests, calling for the creation of a legal mechanism to ensure fair presidential elections. Tikhanovskaya said it was essential to make the most of the momentum generated by these protests.
Я готова принять на себя ответственность и выступить в этот период в качестве национального лидера с тем, чтобы страна успокоилась, вошла в нормальный ритм, чтобы мы освободили всех политзаключенных и в кратчайшие сроки подготовили законодательную базу и условия для организации новых президентских выборов. Реальных, честных и прозрачных выборов, которые будут безоговорочно приняты мировым сообществом.
Fresh protests took place in Belarus today, just one day after Belarus saw its biggest protests over the weekend. Protesters gathered outside several factories and the headquarters of state television in Minsk following a call from Belarus's opposition for a general strike. Yesterday, anti-government rallies began near Victory Park in the capital of Minsk, with crowds carrying flags and banners marching to Independence Square. These mass protests dwarfed a pro-government rally led by President Lukashenko himself. The rival rallies took place after Russia agreed to provide security assistance in the case of external military threats to Belarus.
Поддержать не только меня, но и защитить страну. Не жалейте этого времени. Что с вами, белорусы?
Meanwhile, the European Union has also taken note of the political unrest in Belarus. Member states have decided to hold an emergency summit on August 18th to discuss the unfolding crisis in Belarus. The EU has launched a process of imposing sanctions on Belarusian officials accused of election fraud. Germany, a prominent member of the European grouping, has threatened wide-ranging sanctions against Belarus. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom has said that it does not recognize the results of the Belarusian presidential elections. The UK has also called for an independent investigation into the disputed results. In a statement, UK's Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab said, and I quote, "The world has watched with horror at the violence used by the Belarusian authorities to suppress the peaceful protests that followed this fraudulent presidential election. The UK does not accept the results." And for more details, let's quickly go across to our correspondent Benji Haya, who's joining me live from London at this hour. Benji, a very warm welcome to you. Now that Lukashenko has said that he's willing to share power, what does his statement translate into for the opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya?
Well, yes, it's a huge development in Belarus that he said he would share power, but I think the attitude from a lot of Western nations, including the UK, where I am, has pretty much been the same. Full-on condemnation, rejecting the outcome of the result, and also rejecting the violence that we've seen in order to try to quash those protests that have really increased in number and passion over the last couple of days since the election. The statement from Dominic Raab, pretty stern, pretty clear and to the point. As you mentioned before, he has condemned the election as rigged and also says that he's watched with horror at some of the scenes played out in central Minsk. So the attitude from the UK is that they still want this to be resolved, as do the rest of the European Union. The Foreign Secretary's remarks follow similar sentiments from the bloc, who have said that they do not trust the outcome or legitimacy of the vote in which Mr. Lukashenko on August 9th declared victory convincingly against his opponent, who's now fled to Lithuania. And a lot of the developments we're now seeing are for further calls for sanctions, for actually punishments which will hold the Belarusian authorities to account. So Mr. Lukashenko may very well try to turn around and say that he wants to share power, but I think the UK and indeed many other Western partners want to see potentially another rerun of that election, some legitimacy, some proper foundation of democracy, which of course President Lukashenko and the Belarusian government have outright refused to do. So there is this clear standoff between the UK, the EU versus Belarus, who have not, of course, not part of the European Union, who have aligned themselves instead to Russia. What happens next is anyone's guess, really. It's a very turbulent time in Belarus. Things are changing all the time. Right.
It's interesting, Benji, that you mentioned the amount of international pressure that's currently building on Lukashenko. On that note, what sort of impact have Sunday's rallies in Minsk had on Lukashenko?
It's difficult to tell so far. Obviously, there are just initial calls from the European Union, led by Germany a few days ago. Those have now been followed by the UK, who are calling for an independent investigation. Of course, Mr. Lukashenko's government may very well turn around and say that that investigation does not have any legitimacy in Belarus, and he has, at the moment, full authority and no intention to resign. So there's nothing forcing him at the moment to step down. I think what will have potentially more influence is what happens on the other side, the east side of Belarus, Russia, and what role Vladimir Putin has to play in all of this. Belarus being more of an ally of Russia than the European Union. So the pressure will continue from the West, sanctions, independent investigations and so on, but it might take action or dialogue rhetoric from Russia and Moscow, in particular Vladimir Putin, which will steer Mr. Lukashenko in a particular direction, and I think that will have greater weight than potentially what the European Union tries to impose.
Right, we'll have to wait and watch how what sort of role Russia plays in this entire scenario. On that note, thank you so much, Benji, for joining us on this broadcast.